Out of, I think it's about 300 songs that John and I wrote together, we never had a dry session.
At 83, Sir Paul McCartney is beyond introductions, beyond decorum, and far beyond the boundaries that once shaped his public image. Yet as cameras rolled and microphones captured every glimmer of his wit, the world found itself witnessing something it rarely gets from legends of his caliber: raw honesty. No one invited Paul McCartney to the White House, the host teased, to which Paul responded with the kind of grin that could only belong to a man who has outlived his need for approval. This wasn't the charming young Beatle with a polished smile and scripted replies. This was the knighted musician who wrote the soundtrack to generations, now comfortable enough to look straight into the lens and drop his guard. His voice, still laced with that unmistakable Liverpool warmth, carried amusement and mischief as he prepared to confess something entirely unexpected. 7 women, 7 names, each tied to a memory that once made his pulse quicken. Gone were the days of subtle press diplomacy or carefully managed PR lines. Here stood a man with nothing to hide, willing to admit that even icons have private fantasies. The tone wasn't scandalous but nostalgic, almost tender, as though he were leafing through an old photo album and smiling at the what-ifs of youth. "At my age," he joked, "you stop pretending." And in that moment, the Beatles' mythos felt human again, not the distant gods of rock, but men who lived, longed, and laughed like the rest of us. The confession that followed would ripple across the world not for its audacity, but for its charm, the sense that one of music's most carefully guarded gentlemen had finally let his humanity speak louder than his legend. The question was simple, but its answer would prove irresistible. Which voices, which women, had once made the great Sir Paul McCartney lose his composure? Sir Paul Unplugged. In that quiet studio where decades of interviews had blurred into routine, Paul McCartney did something few celebrities dare. He dropped the script. His laugh, unmistakable and boyish despite the years, echoed through the room as he leaned forward and said, "You want the naughty stuff, do you?" It wasn't arrogance, but ease, the confidence of a man who no longer needs to impress, only to tell the truth. The reporter's question had been cheeky. Which singers did he secretly want? For a moment, silence. Then Paul's eyes sparkled and history leaned in. What followed wasn't gossip or sensationalism. It was the gentle unraveling of memory, a peek into the emotional fabric behind one of the world's most composed performers. He spoke like a man revisiting old songs, with affection, humor, and the self-awareness of someone who knows the difference between youth and immortality. Every story, every name he uttered felt less like a confession and more like a melody, playful, reflective, and steeped in the rhythm of time. The former Beatle, once burdened by fame's microscope, now seemed liberated, free to be mischievous and sentimental in equal measure. He laughed about how back then everything was documented, every glance analyzed. "You had to be careful," he said, "but we were still young men." In his tone, there was no regret, only gratitude for the moments that might have been. That balance between charm and candor made the interview magnetic. It wasn't a man spilling secrets, but one sharing private echoes of an extraordinary life. As he prepared to name the 7 women who had stirred his imagination, the studio air seemed to hold its breath. The cameras caught that signature McCartney twinkle, the same one that made millions fall in love. And just like that, what could have been a trivial question became something more, a reminder that even legends carry unspoken stories, that beneath the fame and formality, there still beats a very human heart. Dusty Springfield, The Velvet Invitation. When Paul McCartney uttered the name Dusty Springfield, it wasn't simply nostalgia, it was reverence. In the glowing chaos of 1960s London, where the Beatles ruled the charts and youth culture rewrote the rules, Dusty was something different. She was the mystery wrapped in eyeliner, the storm behind the microphone, the velvet danger that haunted smoke-filled backrooms of Soho. Paul recalled those moments with a grin that betrayed more than admiration. It was fascination, the kind that lingers even decades later. "Dusty Springfield," he said slowly, as though tasting the memory. "She could have had me doing backflips just by humming in my ear." He remembered the energy of that era, the clubs, the flashbulbs, the tension between image and impulse. The Beatles were under a microscope. Every glance and whisper could spark a headline, and Paul knew that too well. Yet even in that pressure, Dusty's presence cracked through. She wasn't just beautiful, she was commanding. Every note she sang carried the weight of unspoken promises and the thrill of what might never be. Her voice wasn't just sound, it was seduction wrapped in melancholy. Paul admitted he'd been cautious then, the good Beatle, the one who kept his image clean. But even now at 83, the admission carried a smile. "If she'd crooked her finger," he said, "I'd have followed." It wasn't lust that lingered, it was admiration for the woman who could blend grace with danger so effortlessly. And in that moment, the legendary Beatle revealed something deeper. That even icons remember the ones who left them spellbound, not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. "Cher, the goddess who let you chase." When McCartney mentioned Cher, the studio seemed to brighten, as if her presence decades away could still command the room. He chuckled softly before saying her name, his tone equal parts respect and amusement. Cher, he admitted, she was dangerous in the best way. The goddess of pop was unlike anyone else in that golden era, statuesque, bold, and unshakably confident. Paul described her as the embodiment of control, a woman who didn't seek attention but drew it effortlessly. She was the kind of person who didn't chase, she allowed herself to be chased. "I've always gone weak around that," Paul confessed with a knowing smirk, his voice dropping to a mischievous whisper. He spoke of her as though she were less a celebrity and more a gravitational force. Her hair, her stare, her laugh, each seemed designed to disarm even the most self-assured man. "She had this confidence," he said, "that made you forget you were supposed to be clever." For Paul, it wasn't just attraction, it was awe at the kind of power that could silence a room without effort. He joked that if he'd ever been left alone in a room with her, he wouldn't have stood a chance. There was no lustful exaggeration, just that quiet acknowledgement of an energy he still remembered vividly. "If Cher had ever told me to follow her," he said, laughing, "I'd have been out the door before she put her coat on." It was a confession spoken like a fan rather than a peer, revealing how even music royalty can be humbled by presence alone. For a man who once ruled the world stage, it was disarming to hear him admit that sometimes, even a Beatle was just another admirer lost in someone else's orbit. When the name Tina Turner surfaced, Paul's entire demeanor shifted, his eyes lit with admiration, his words carrying both reverence and thrill. "Tina Turner," he said, his voice lowering like a man remembering a fire he'd once stood too close to. Now that was a woman who could set a man on fire without even touching him. He spoke of her performances as though recalling a natural phenomenon, sweat, movement, energy that made the ground itself seem alive. "You didn't just watch Tina," he explained. "You braced yourself." Her presence was both intimidating and magnetic, her voice could shake the walls, her power could silence entire stadiums. Paul recalled the sheer energy of her stage presence, saying it made even fellow musicians forget their craft for a moment. She wasn't performing, she was commanding, and that's what made her unforgettable. He joked softly, "If she'd ever turned that energy on me, I'd have been finished." But beneath the humor was deep admiration. Turner represented the kind of freedom artists rarely achieve, raw, unfiltered, unapologetic. "She didn't ask permission," Paul said, "she just took the stage." There was a brief silence before he added, "And I'd have let her take me too." He laughed, shaking his head like a man still a little in awe of what he'd witnessed. "Tina," he said, "embodied something that transcended beauty or fame. She was power incarnate, the pure electricity of performance." If Dusty was velvet and Cher was steel, Tina Turner was lightning, unforgettable, unpredictable, and entirely unstoppable. And even after all these years, Paul's tone carried that spark, a kind of reverent disbelief that he had shared an era with someone capable of making gods out of mortals and mortals out of legends. Lulu, the mischief in a smile. The way Paul said her name, Lulu, it came out like laughter before memory. The studio filled with that signature McCartney charm as he described her, tiny in stature but enormous in spirit, a burst of sunlight wrapped in the chaos of swinging London. Lulu, he said, had an energy that made everyone feel 16 again. She was fun, fearless, and possessed a spark that made even the most disciplined musicians lose composure. "She could make you laugh in one breath and wonder what she was up to in the next," Paul recalled with a nostalgic grin. In those days when every night felt like an after-party waiting to happen, Lulu's presence was magnetic. She wasn't just the girl with the golden smile, she was a firecracker who could turn a quiet room into a dance floor. "You'd be talking to someone else," he said, "then you'd hear her laugh and that was it, you were gone." Described her voice with warmth, not just a singer's voice, but a tone that teased, that hinted at trouble. "She had this giggle," Paul said, lowering his tone, "that made you think of all the things you shouldn't be thinking." There was humor in his words, but also affection. For all his fame, all his self-control, Lulu made him feel human, young, reckless, and curious again. "If she'd whispered something cheeky in my ear," he joked, "I might have written a very different kind of love song the next morning." But beneath the laughter, there was fondness. Lulu represented a simpler time when fame was new, the nights were endless, and temptation wore a smile instead of a scandal. It wasn't about what could have happened, it was about how she made life feel alive. By the time Barbara Streisand's name left his lips, the energy in Paul's tone shifted from playful to reverent. "Barbara," he said, shaking his head slightly, "she didn't walk into a room, she owned it." He described her with the admiration of a craftsman acknowledging a masterpiece. Streisand, he explained, had an aura that silenced chaos, intellect, artistry, and elegance, all wrapped into one commanding figure. Unlike the teasing charisma of Lulu or the explosive fire of Tina, Barbara was composure incarnate. "She didn't need to flirt," Paul explained. "She just looked at you, opened her mouth, and that voice did the rest." His tone softened as he recalled how her singing felt like standing too close to something divine. "She could have sung the phone book," he said with a grin, "and I'd still have gone weak by the letter D. There was humor, yes, but also awe, the kind reserved for those rare few who make art feel like magic." Paul admitted that if Barbara had ever leaned over a piano and sung just for him, he'd have forgotten how to play. "That's saying something," he chuckled, his eyes gleaming. What fascinated him most wasn't just her beauty or power, but her intelligence, that sharp wit and effortless confidence that turned conversations into performances. "You don't argue with Barbara Streisand," he added with a smile. "You just say yes." It wasn't a confession of desire, but admiration for a woman who embodied perfection, someone who, like him, had turned ambition into art. To hear a Beatle speak of her with such humility was telling. Barbara wasn't just a fantasy, she was a reminder that true artistry transcends attraction. It inspires devotion. Diana Ross, the supreme spell. When the conversation turned to Diana Ross, Paul's tone dropped into something almost reverent. "Now Diana," he said with a sly smile, "that woman didn't just sing, she hypnotized." In the height of Motown's reign, when the Supremes were defining American glamour and the Beatles were rewriting musical history, the two worlds occasionally collided. Paul remembered those moments vividly, the glittering award shows, the shared admiration, the sense that both acts were shaping something larger than fame itself. "She had this air about her," he said, "like royalty, but it wasn't cold, it was magnetic. When she smiled," he added, "you forgot your own name." Diana Ross, in his words, was elegance embodied, confident, composed, and always in control. "She didn't flirt," Paul explained, "she commanded. It wasn't about chasing her, it was about being chosen. And if she'd ever chosen me," he added with a quiet laugh, "I'd have followed without a second thought." There was a certain poetry in his description, the Beatle who once ruled stages around the world admitting he'd have gladly been just another man under her spell. He imagined her singing not to a crowd, but close, softly, intimately. "If she'd ever sung just for me," he said, "that would have been it, game over." His admiration wasn't youthful fantasy anymore, it was gratitude for sharing an era with someone who made perfection look effortless. For Paul, Diana wasn't just another name on the list. She was a reflection of an entire generation's grace, proof that power could be elegant and that seduction could live in a single knowing glance. Janis Joplin, the chaos he craved. Then came the wild one, Janis Joplin. Even saying her name seemed to ignite something in Paul's voice. "Good Lord," he said with a half-smile, half-sigh, "she was chaos in boots." Unlike the polished allure of Diana or the poised confidence of Barbara, Janis was raw, the kind of energy that couldn't be contained, only survived. "You never knew what she'd do next," Paul recalled, and that's what made her so captivating. He described her not like a crush, but like a force of nature, untamed, unpredictable, and unforgettable. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, he admitted, but that's what made her magnetic. "She didn't care about being perfect," he said. "She just was." Her voice, rough and explosive, carried truth in every crack. "You'd watch her sing," Paul continued, "and you'd think, my God, what would it be like if all that fire was turned on you?" It wasn't lust or admiration, it was fascination with authenticity. In an era where image ruled, Janis was rebellion personified. "She could kiss you, slap you, and make you cry all in the same 5 minutes," he said with a laugh, "and somehow you'd still thank her for it." He imagined, perhaps half-jokingly, that if she'd ever pulled him into a corner, he'd have followed without question. There was no pretense in his voice, just honesty, the recognition that even legends yearn for what's real. "She wasn't the kind you forget," he said softly. "She was the kind you remember for the rest of your life." In that single confession, Paul revealed not just admiration, but the artist's eternal hunger for raw truth, the chaos that fuels creation. The Cheeky Night, Reflections of a Legend. When the list was finally complete, the room felt lighter, as though history itself had exhaled. 7 names, 7 stories, each a thread in the tapestry of a life that had already defined an era. But for Paul McCartney, this wasn't scandal or vanity, it was closure. "At my age," he said with that familiar smile, "you stop pretending." It was less a confession than a celebration, a gentle acknowledgement that fame and fantasy, art and affection had always been intertwined. For decades, he'd been the cute Beatle, the heartthrob, the world's most scrutinized musician. Yet here at 83, he allowed himself the gift of honesty. No PR lines, no polished deflections, just the truth of a man who had lived fully and remembered fondly. Each woman on that list represented more than attraction. They symbolized an era, a spirit, a sound. Dusty's velvet danger, Cher's command, Tina's fire, Lulu's laughter, Barbara's elegance, Diana's grace, Janis's chaos. Together, they painted a portrait not of desire, but of humanity. In sharing their names, Paul reminded the world that legends are not carved in marble, they are flesh, memory, and melody. "These weren't little crushes," he'd said with a grin. "They were the kind of women you'd miss soundcheck for." His laughter carried warmth, not regret. The world saw not a man indulging in nostalgia, but a storyteller revisiting his own songbook, a song still unfinished. And as the cameras faded, one thing became clear. Sir Paul McCartney, the knight, the Beatle, the poet of a generation, remains exactly what he has always been, a man in love with life and unafraid to admit it.